The Forgotten Legend Chapter 1. The Return. The void of space had swallowed them whole. 500 years had passed since the Phantom Legion vanished into the abyss, a battalion of elite space marines, lost in a doomed campaign on the fringes of the galaxy. Their fate became legend, a whispered tale among soldiers and scholars alike. A cautionary myth for the brave, a dark legend for the superstitious. Their mission had been clear: to suppress a rogue faction of the Dominion Empire, but the campaign had ended in disaster. Their ship had gone silent, their last transmission nothing but static, and the void had claimed them, until now. The massive Dyson Sphere loomed in the darkness, its impossible structure harnessing the energy of a captive star, bathing the surrounding space in a cold, almost unearthly light. It had been an enigma for centuries, theorized to be a relic of a forgotten civilization, a gargantuan machine of incomprehensible power, but never approached. No ship had ventured near it in all the years that followed the Legion's disappearance. And yet here it was, standing, silent and waiting. Then reality itself began to shatter. A rift in space unraveled, like torn fabric snapping in the wind, and through it, a battlecruiser emerged, its massive hull creaking under the strain of its unexpected re-entry into this dimension. The ship was battered, yet eerily intact. Untouched by time's decay, and despite the hostile environment of space, it held its shape as though it had never left. Its insignia, Legion Eth, the Forgotten, still marked its side, a faint but unmistakable sigil. The ship had returned. But the questions piled up. Why? How? What had become of its crew? Inside the cruiser, armored figures moved with chilling precision, their steps heavy and synchronized. The ship hummed with mechanical life, but the sounds of its engine and the creaks of its walls were drowned out by the strange silence of its passengers. They were soldiers, once human, once men who had bled on the battlefields of distant worlds, but now they were something more, something different. Their weapons were primed, their visors glowing faintly in the dim corridors, reflecting the cold light of distant stars. Yet there was something wrong. The soldiers moved without the heavy breath of living men, and their footfalls echoed unnaturally in the sterile air. Their voices, when they spoke, carried an edge, a hollow resonance that suggested they were not entirely what they appeared to be. They were trapped in time, alone in the black for centuries, and now they had returned, but they were not the same. Captain Darius Voss stood at the command deck, his gaze locked on the swirling void beyond the viewport. His gauntlet tightened. As he activated the ship's logs, his mind still trying to piece together the impossibility of what was happening. The ship's systems had come online, but they were sluggish, damaged. Yet it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Time had passed. So much time. He called up the last transmission, a garbled, almost incoherent mess. The faces of his crew flickered in and out of the static, their expressions haunted, desperate. A Marine screamed as his weapon fired blindly into the darkness. Then silence. The display flickered again. Another distortion, the last words. We were dead. We were dead. The voice was strained, filled with dread. The transmission cut out. Voss stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the words settling heavily in his chest. We were dead. Turning slowly, Voss locked eyes with his second in command, Lieutenant Soren, whose dark, expressionless helmet gave nothing away. The lieutenant stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. His posture even now was flawless, like a well-programmed machine. But the silence between them spoke volumes. Soren's helmeted head tilted slightly. Then why are we still standing? Voss didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the bridge, the once pristine controls now flashing with error messages, the eerie glow of the interface seeming to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. He felt the cold weight of the reality they had stepped back into. The silence of space had never been so heavy. The uncertainty of the moment felt suffocating. We were dead, Voss repeated, quieter this time. We should be, but we're not. Lieutenant Soren stepped forward, his boots making a muted clang against the metal. Floor, are we the same? Voss's gaze returned to the viewport, to the Dyson Sphere, a strange, ominous sentinel in the distance. His hand rested on the cool metal of the captain's chair. I don't know, he said softly. But then, from somewhere deep within the bowels of the ship, a sound echoed. A low hum, distant at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a vibration that resonated in the bones of every soldier aboard the cruiser. It was as though the ship itself had come alive, or perhaps something had woken within it. Soren's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but Voss held up a hand to stop him. Wait, let's see what it is. The hum continued to grow, louder, and suddenly the ship's emergency lights flickered on, casting an unsettling red glow over the darkened corridors. The ship seemed to be pulsing with energy that shouldn't have been there. Something was moving, deep in the heart of the cruiser. Voss stood slowly, his gauntlet clenching into a fist. Prepare yourselves, he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Something is coming, his words echoed in the stillness. The soldiers around him stiffened, their movements more tense now, more purposeful. They had been to the ends of the galaxy. They had fought in impossible battles. But this was different. The air around them seemed to thrum with something ancient, something forgotten, and it was about to make its presence known. In the depths of the ship, something moved, something alive, and as the hull of the cruiser creaked and groaned in protest, the last remnants of the Phantom Legion prepared for a fight. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark. The Dyson Sphere was no ordinary relic. It was a machine, ancient, vast and alive in ways no one could comprehend. From the moment the Phantom Legion's ship drifted toward it, a shift in the fabric of reality seemed to stir within the sphere's core. It wasn't just an object, it was a presence, watching, waiting, and now responding. Deep within the sphere's surface, mechanisms that had lain dormant for centuries, perhaps millennia, awakened. Strange, ancient data streams surged through, unseen veins beneath its polished exterior, flickering with patterns that defied all logic. The sphere was not a relic. It was a machine of unfathomable purpose, designed by forces long forgotten. It had been waiting for this moment. Now it would act. On the bridge of the battlecruiser, Captain Darius Voss stood, his fingers resting lightly on the command console. His mind raced, torn between a sense of awe and dread as the Dyson Sphere filled the viewport. The ship had been eerily quiet, its movements sluggish, but it was drawing closer to the sphere, and something was shifting in the air. The darkness beyond the viewport pulsed, as if the universe itself held its breath. Prepare a reconnaissance team, Voss ordered, his voice steady, though a knot tightened in his chest. We need to understand what we're dealing with. A squad of Marines, hardened veterans of countless wars, stood ready. Each one, a master of combat, a survivor of countless campaigns, suited up and stepped into the shuttle bay. They moved with practiced precision, their heavy boots clanging against the steel floor as the hangar doors slowly yawned open. The vastness of the Dyson Sphere stretched before them like a wall of stone. A dark, impossible thing hovering in. Base! The shuttle's engines hummed as the group ascended into the void. As they descended, the surface of the sphere gleamed, its impossibly smooth exterior shimmering in the cold light. But something was wrong. Something was watching them. Corporal Rains was the first to feel it. A creeping sensation crawled beneath. His skin, as if unseen eyes were probing his every thought. His heartbeat quickened, but not from the exertion of flight. It was something else, something unnatural. He checked his vitals, but when his HUD flashed, his breath caught in his throat. The screen flickered. His heart rate was 0. That was impossible. Rains slammed his fist against his helmet, trying to recalibrate the system. His pulse was steady, his breath coming in shallow, measured gasps. His body was alive. He was alive. And yet, the system had marked him as dead. What the hell? He muttered under his breath, glancing around at his squad mates. The sensation only intensified. Every soldier had their helmet on. but Rains swore he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. The strange, hollow presence of the Dyson Sphere was pressing against them all, stifling. "You guys seeing this?" Rains asked, his voice low, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his rifle. There was no answer. A silence stretched too long, too tense. Then one by one, his comrades' visors flickered, their data feeds glitching, distorting like corrupted files. The eerie hum of the shuttle's engines seemed to fade into nothingness, replaced by something far more unsettling, and then the whispers began. At first it was nothing more than a faint rustling, like the wind stirring through the trees, but as the noise grew louder, Rains could hear it more clearly. It was as if the shuttle's communication system had picked up static, a strange interference in the comms. But this wasn't interference, it was something far worse. A voice, no, many voices. They were speaking in a language Rains couldn't even begin to understand. Ancient, twisted tongues that seemed to reverberate in his skull, filling the space between his ears like 1,000 muted screams. The words were not meant for mortal minds. His fingers tightened around the rifle, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't help but feel like he was being pulled by the voices, by the presence of something deep within the sphere. Something that had waited for their return. Rains's mind screamed at him to focus, to shake off the rising terror, but it was impossible. The whispers slithered through the comms, crawling under his skin, scratching at his nerves. His hand reached for the communications panel, but before he could activate it, the shuttle's controls seemed to glitch. "We're not alone," the words echoed in his mind like a dull thud. His squad had heard them too. All their visors flickered, their heads jerking toward each other as the whispers grew louder. The sound seemed to bleed through the very walls of the shuttle, reverberating within the metal shell. In the darkness beyond the shuttle, the shadows shifted. Something was out there, and it was hungry. The shuttle's descent slowed, the silence hanging thick and heavy like a fog. Rain's heartbeat pounded in his ears, his mind racing. The landing was smooth, too smooth, almost as though the surface of the Dyson Sphere was welcoming them. The strange feeling of being watched never left. It grew sharper, as though eyes were piercing into the very marrow of his bones. The air around them seemed to pulse, breathing, living, alive. The squad disembarked, weapons at the ready. Their boots made no sound as they stepped onto the impossibly smooth surface. The world around them bathed in an eerie glow. The ground was flawless, without so much as a scratch or crack. Yet the longer they stood there, the more the whispers seemed to creep in, infiltrating their minds. Rains blinked, his helmeted head swiveling as he tried to steady his thoughts. "Stay alert," he barked, his voice gruff. His squad nodded in silent agreement, forming a tight formation as they moved forward. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were closer now. Suddenly a shadow darted across the surface, too fast, too fluid. It was gone before anyone could react, slipping back into the deep crevices of the Dyson Sphere. The Marines tensed, their weapons raised. Something watched them. Something hunted them, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the darkness. And then, all at once, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, Rains thought he could hear his own heartbeat, the blood rushing in his ears. His breath caught, but just as quickly as the silence had fallen, a new noise filled the air. A low, guttural hum. Something was moving within the Dyson Sphere. Something ancient. Something alive. Chapter 3. The true nightmare back aboard the battlecruiser. Alarms suddenly blared, their shrill wail slicing through the silence of the command deck. The sound was deafening, relentless. Voss stood frozen, his eyes glued to the holographic display that filled the bridge. The faces of his Marines, each a steadfast warrior, each one trained to endure the horrors of war, flickered on the screen. But now, one by one, their life signs disappeared. Gone in an instant. No gunfire, no screams, no warning. Just silence. Voss felt the air grow cold around him as the horrible truth began to set in. The Marines were dead. He had sent them to their deaths, all for a mission that had turned from reconnaissance into something far worse. His fingers hovered over the controls, desperate to find answers, to break the silence that was closing in on him like a tomb. But the data was corrupted. The feeds from the shuttle were fragmented, distorted, and then utterly blank. There was no sign of the team, only static. "What the hell is happening?" Voss muttered under his breath, his voice strained as he turned. To his second-in-command, Lieutenant Soren, standing at his side, had his gaze fixed on the same screens, his expression unreadable. "The life signs, they're just gone, sir," Soren said, his voice clipped, betraying none of the fear that Voss knew had to be there. But fear was a virus, and it spread quickly in moments like this. The kind of fear that paralyzed, the kind of fear that killed. "Get them back." Voss's command was sharp. His pulse quickened, but he fought to maintain control. He was a soldier, a leader. He had to think to act, but the lack of answers left him grasping at shadows. But there was no response. The systems were failing. The sphere was doing this. It was toying with them just as it had done with the reconnaissance team. The prison. He realized now that the Dyson Sphere was no inert relic, no long-forgotten construct. It was a prison. And something inside, had just been unleashed. Before Voss could react, a piercing static scream reverberated through the bridge's speakers, so loud it rattled the bones in his chest. The sound was like nails scraping across metal, a deep, reverberating shriek that seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself. His hands shot to his ears, but it was already too late. The scream cut through him, filled him, tore through every fiber of his being, left nothing but an emptiness that felt as though it had sucked the very air out of the room. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the scream stopped. A long, agonizing silence followed. It felt like a death sentence. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, a voice, soft but chilling. "Run," the word echoed through the bridge, a sound that could have been coming from a ghost or from something far worse. Voss stiffened, his blood freezing in his veins. He had heard that voice, he recognized it, barely. It was one of the Marines, the last man in the reconnaissance team. But the tone, it wasn't human anymore. There was something cold, something unnatural about it, a malice that dripped from the word like poison seeping into his mind. Run. The order hung in the air, a command too chilling to ignore. But how could they run? They were trapped in the void of space, locked in the orbit of a machine that had just woken from its slumber. The sphere had already ensnared them. It was impossible to escape. And yet, the thought of running, of retreating, became overwhelming. Survival. A primal instinct gnawed at Voss's mind, whispering that the only way to escape the horrors that had been unleashed was to flee. But where would they go? The sphere loomed, its massive form a constant, unyielding presence that threatened to swallow them whole. Shut it off, Voss snapped, his mind racing. Get the comms offline, now! But the orders were futile. The systems were no longer responding to commands. The ship was trapped, suffocating under the weight of whatever had been awakened in the Dyson Sphere. He slammed his fist against the command console, frustration boiling over. They were dead. His Marines were dead, his ship was dead, and the only thing left was silence, the crushing, inevitable silence of the void. "Captain," Soren said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were wide, his hands shaking as he slowly turned to face Voss. "Look." Voss's gaze followed Soren's, but for a moment he couldn't understand what he was seeing. The viewport was empty. Nothing but the endless expanse of space. But then the lights flickered, and in the darkness there was movement. A shadow, shifting in the distance, too fast, too fluid to be natural. It moved across the surface of the Dyson Sphere, darting from one hidden crevice to the next, and Voss's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. They weren't alone. The hunting had begun. Suddenly the ship shook, a violent tremor rocking the battlecruiser. The hull creaked, as though something was pushing from within, pressing against the fragile walls of their ship. A terrible screech echoed through the metal of the ship, a sound that was unmistakable. The sphere was alive. It was coming for them. Voss gripped the command console, his knuckles white. He had been in countless battles, faced down enemy fleets, and survived impossible odds. But this was different. There was no enemy here. There was no tactical advantage. It was them against something ancient, something hungry, and it was only a matter of time before the machine would consume them. "Seal the bulkheads," Voss ordered, his voice hoarse. "Lock down every access point. No one gets off this ship." Battalion crew scrambled to obey, their faces pale as they worked frantically to seal the ship. But Voss knew it wouldn't matter. The sphere had already marked them. It had already begun to hunt them, and no one could escape its grasp. As the bulkhead slammed shut and the last remaining hatches sealed, Voss turned to his crew, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their survival was no longer a matter of tactics or strategy. It was simply a waiting game, a game of survival, but with the cards stacked against them. And in the deep, eternal dark of space, it was becoming clear. The true nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 4. Descent into Oblivion. Voss didn't hesitate. His voice cut through the tense silence of the bridge, sharp and commanding. "All hands! Battle formation!" The Marines sprang into action, their movements precise and fluid, honed by years of combat. Weapons were raised and the clang of armored boots echoed through the corridors. The ship was alive with the eerie tension of soldiers preparing for something far more terrifying than they had ever faced. The lights above flickered, dimming before returning to full strength, as if something within the ship itself was struggling to maintain control. The hum of the reactors, normally steady and reassuring, stuttered, sending a ripple of unease through the crew. It was as though something vast and ancient was draining the very energy of the ship, siphoning it into the depths of the Dyson Sphere. Lieutenant Soren's voice was taut with urgency as he barked into his comms. "Recon team report." But there was only static in response, a deafening silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Voss's jaw clenched as he looked around at the faces of his remaining crew, their expressions tight with fear that none of them would dare show outwardly. They had trained for moments like this, but no amount of preparation could have prepared them for what was happening now. Voss turned sharply to the helm. His mind raced, calculating options, formulating desperate plans. "Get us out of here!" The order was simple, but the weight of it was suffocating. The ship's engines roared to life with a violent burst of power, and the cruiser shuddered as it attempted to break free from the sphere's pull. But as the engines surged, it became apparent that something was holding them in place, a force far beyond the physical limitations of the ship, a force older than gravity itself, a presence that defied the laws of nature. The Dyson Sphere was tightening its grip around them like a vice, a massive, inescapable hand of fate that refused to let go. Voss's eyes narrowed. The control panels before him flashed red, warning lights blinking urgently. "Report!" he barked. "We can't move, sir." The helmsman's voice was shaky, a crack of fear creeping into the edges of his words. "It's like the sphere's got a hold of us. We're stuck." Voss's mind raced, but there was no time for panic. His instincts kicked in, and he turned to his team. "Prepare for boarding action." The words were cold, calculating. The crew had to be ready for anything. They would fight their way out if they had to. Before anyone could respond, the screams began. They came suddenly, shrill and gut-wrenching, a cacophony of agony that echoed from the lower levels of the ship. Voss froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as the screams tore through the hull. His mind couldn't comprehend the sound at first. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way he understood life. The voices were distorted, shrieking in a chorus of pain that reverberated through the walls, an alien wail that sent chills crawling across his skin. Voss's fist clenched around the arm of his command chair as the screams grew louder, more frantic, as though something or someone was being torn apart. He turned to Lieutenant Soren, but before he could speak, the lights above them flickered again, and the air in the bridge seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. "What the hell is happening?" Soren asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with disbelief. Voss didn't have an answer. He could feel it now. The ship wasn't just being held in place by the Dyson Sphere. Something else was aboard. Something that had been unleashed. Something hunting them. The comms crackled, and for a brief moment Voss thought he heard something. Someone on the other end. A breathless voice, strained and desperate. "Captain." The voice was garbled. A mix of static and something else. Something far more primal. "Get out." But the transmission was abruptly cut off. "Get us out of here," Voss shouted again, but it was too late. The ship groaned, the hull shuddering violently as something huge, unseen, slammed against it. The tremor rattled through the entire cruiser, throwing the crew off balance. Voss gripped the command chair, his knuckles white, his mind working frantically to process what was happening. And then, a shadow moved. At first, it was a blur at the corner of his vision. A flicker of something large and quick darting between the corridors, far too fast for a human to track. Voss's breath caught in his throat. The shadow seemed to pulse with malice as though it were alive, feeding off the ship itself. "What is that?" Soren whispered, his voice shaking. But Voss didn't answer. His mind was already racing ahead, plotting a course of action that felt increasingly impossible. Suddenly, a loud bang, a door being ripped off its hinges, echoed from the lower levels. A team of Marines, fully armored and armed, rushed past them toward the source of the disturbance. Voss turned, eyes narrowing. He could hear their voices, shouting commands, but they were drowned out by a horrible, wet sound that followed them, like something crawling, dragging itself across the floor, and then came the snapping of bone. The men screamed, their voices abruptly cut off. The sounds of battle were quickly replaced by silence. The weight of that silence pressed down on Voss's chest like a suffocating force. He turned back to Soren, who had his weapon raised, but his hands were shaking, his body tense. "Where are they?" Soren asked in a strangled whisper. Voss's eyes darted across the bridge. He could feel the presence, something dark and ancient, moving closer with every passing second. The sphere wasn't just a machine. It wasn't just a prison. It was a guardian, a protector of something far worse that had been hidden away for millennia. And now, it was awake. The screams started again. This time, they were joined by a terrible grinding noise. It was as though the ship itself was being devoured, piece by piece, by an unseen force. "Captain," Soren's voice trembled. "What are we up against?" Voss's eyes burned with determination. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Not when every moment felt like it could be their last. He turned toward the viewport, staring into the darkness. The Dyson Sphere loomed there, a massive, impenetrable presence. They were running out of time. They were running out of hope, but they were soldiers, and soldiers fought. "Prepare for anything, Soren, whatever it is." Voss's voice was cold, ironclad. He turned, locking eyes with his lieutenant. "We are not dying here." But as the words left his lips, the first shadow entered the room, and the true descent began. Chapter 5. The dying light, the recon team had vanished. It happened too quickly for anyone to understand. One moment, they were making their way through the depths of the ship, their voices crackling through the comms. Then, nothing. The communication. Lines filled with tortured, incoherent whispers. Voices twisted by fear and madness. Sounds that clawed at the edges of reality itself. Static swallowed the final moments of their lives, and the feed cut off abruptly. The last image, captured before the signal was lost, was haunting. A blackened figure, its silhouette barely visible in the shadows of the Dyson Sphere, stood motionless. The figure had too many eyes, too many unnatural gleaming orbs staring out from the void, peering into the very soul of anyone who dared look. That was the moment when the horror truly set in. Something was consuming the Marines. One by one, their life signs flickered out, swallowed by the unseen terror lurking in the darkness. Voss's blood ran cold. He couldn't explain it, but the figures in the shadows, those things, were hunting them. He could feel it now, The weight of being prey. The overwhelming certainty that the end was drawing closer with every passing second. And whatever had taken the recon team wasn't finished. It was coming for the rest of them. The tremor that rattled through the ship felt like a death knell, a final warning before the end. The hum of the battlecruiser's engines shuddered, as if the ship itself were aware of the danger closing in. The lights flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls of the command deck, and then it came. Tendrils of dark matter, shimmering and writhing with an otherworldly malevolence, slithered from the Dyson Sphere itself. They reached out like fingers, coiling around the battlecruiser, tightening their grip. The dark matter pulsed with an unnatural energy, as though it were alive, feeding off the ship's power. The crew watched in horror as the tendrils began to wrap around the hull, squeezing tighter with each passing moment, like a predator closing in on its prey. A Marine fired his weapon, a powerful shot that should have torn through anything in its path. But the moment the energy hit the tendrils, something impossible happened. The dark matter didn't flinch. It didn't recoil. Instead, the tendrils absorbed the energy, expanding, growing stronger with every shot fired. The Marine's weapon discharged again and again, but it was futile. Each burst of fire vanished into the void, consumed by the tendrils as though they were nothing more than smoke. "We're running out of time," Soren muttered under his breath, his eyes darting nervously from one flickering console to the next. The battlecruiser was under siege. There was no escaping it. Voss stood frozen, his eyes locked on the swirling mass of dark matter. His thoughts raced, his mind calculating and recalculating the odds of survival. The sphere wasn't just a prison. It was a trap designed to keep them in, keep them from leaving. Whatever had been unleashed wasn't just hungry, it was insatiable. Voss turned to Soren, his face pale but his voice steady. "Overload the reactors." Soren's eyes widened in shock. "That'll kill us all." Voss's gaze didn't waver, his hand clenched into a fist as he looked out at the battlecruisers. Failing systems. "We're already dead." A brief silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of that grim realization. They were trapped. There was no escape, no hope. The Dyson Sphere was squeezing the life from them. The dark matter was crawling over every surface, suffocating them, draining the ship's energy. It wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. Voss's mind flashed back to his time as a soldier, how he'd been trained for the worst, for the unthinkable. But nothing had prepared him for this. The comms crackled, and for a brief moment Voss thought he heard something. A scream. No, not a scream, a roar. A primal, otherworldly sound, so terrible and full of rage that it sent shivers down his spine. He gritted his teeth. The tendrils were already pushing into the hallways, creeping through the bulkheads, extending their reach. There was no more time. "Get to the reactors, Soren. Now!" Voss snapped, urgency cutting through his voice. Soren hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. But Voss was right. They had no other choice. With a final, resolute nod, Soren turned, rallying the Marines with him. They had to make it to the heart of the ship. They had to overload the reactors, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. The comms crackled again, this time filled with static and a garbled voice. Voss couldn't make out the words, but the desperation in the tone was clear. More Marines were being lost. They were dying one by one in the grip of the dark matter, their screams swallowed by the void. "Sir," Soren's voice broke through the chaos, dragging Voss's attention back to the present. "We're at the reactor core, but, Captain, the tendrils, they're here." Voss's heart raced. They were too close. If they didn't initiate the overload sequence, if they didn't detonate the reactors now, the sphere would consume them all, leaving nothing but husks in its wake. The battlecruiser shuddered again, the hull groaning as though it was about to collapse under the weight of the dark matter. It was now or never. Voss keyed in the sequence, the familiar beeps of the reactor's countdown starting to sound. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, growing heavier, as though the ship itself was resisting its inevitable end. "Overload in T-3 minutes, Captain." The computer's voice was cold, detached, like a death sentence being read aloud. Voss's grip tightened on the console, his mind sharp despite the growing panic. They had no time to waste. They would overload the reactors, burn everything down, to keep the sphere from consuming them. But as the final seconds ticked away, the roar from the depths of the Dyson Sphere grew louder, and with it, the final, horrifying realization hit Voss. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the very essence of their existence. In the last moments before the reactor went critical, Voss gave one final command. Brace yourselves. The dying light was all that remained. Chapter 6. The Final Stand. The corridors of the battlecruiser were a nightmare. The once sterile halls, so familiar to the Phantom Legion, had become a labyrinth of shadow and chaos. Marines, soldiers forged in the heat of battle, fought valiantly, their weapons blazing in defiance, but it was a losing battle. The tendrils of dark matter were everywhere, slithering through every crack, creeping through every ventilation shaft, tightening their grip on the ship with an unrelenting force. The hull groaned under the pressure, every pulse of energy from the dark matter causing it to shudder like a dying beast. Inside the engineering deck, a team of engineers worked feverishly, their hands shaking as they raced against the clock. The countdown to critical overload had begun. Every second counted. The reactor's core hummed ominously, and then, with an ear-splitting scream, it began to pulse erratically. Warning lights flashed in every corner of the room, casting red, reflections that danced off the walls like blood. The engineers were drenched in sweat, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. They had no time for hesitation. They had no time to second-guess. The entity sensed what they were doing. It knew. The force behind the dark matter, the ancient, malevolent presence that had haunted them since they entered the Dyson Sphere, recognized the threat, and it responded. With terrifying precision, tendrils shot out from the depths of the ship, piercing the hull like 1,000 venomous fangs. The metal screamed as the dark matter burrowed deeper, tearing its way through the ship's reinforced walls. A Marine was caught in the first wave, his body torn as he was pulled into the writhing mass. His screams were cut short, his form lost to the darkness. And then another, and another, each soldier swallowed whole by the blackened tendrils, their armor and flesh merging into the chaos. Voss stood at the bridge, watching as the abyss came for them. His heart pounded, his mind torn between the horror unfolding before him and the cold, unwavering resolve that had been drilled into him for years. His men were dying, being consumed by the very force they had come to stop. His comrades, his brothers in arms, disappearing into the darkness. He felt it then, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The whispers, those twisted voices that had haunted them since they first entered the sphere, grew louder, closer. They were no longer just distant echoes. They were inside his head, crawling through his thoughts. He could hear them now, clear as day, their words wrapping around his mind like a vice. Join us. The words chilled him to the core. The entity, whatever it was, had begun to speak to them directly. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was alive, aware of them, aware of their struggle, and it was calling them to join it. The whispering, voices twisted in pitch, growing louder, more insistent, as if the very essence of the sphere was reaching out to pull them into its grasp. Voss could feel his resolve slipping. For a moment, it seemed as though the darkness itself was within him, tempting him to surrender, to join. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. This was their final stand. With a steadying breath, Voss turned his gaze from the viewport, where the tendrils were now fully visible, writhing in the space outside the ship, and back to the command console. His fingers hovered over the final command. The reactor was in its final stages of meltdown, the countdown, ticking away like the heartbeat of the ship. It was time to end it, to burn everything to stop this nightmare from claiming any more lives. Voss could feel the weight of his choice pressing down on him, but there was no other option. The dark matter had to be destroyed. The sphere had to be destroyed. They had to die, so the rest of the galaxy could live. Join us. The voice. whispered again like a siren's call. Voss's hand trembled as he reached out and pressed the final button. The reactor's core went critical. A surge of power erupted from the battlecruiser's heart. The ship trembled violently, its hull cracking and creaking under the strain. The dark tendrils, which had once seemed so invincible, recoiled as the energy began to pour into the heart of the sphere. The Dyson Sphere itself seemed to shudder, as if it too felt the oncoming destruction. The whispers turned to screams, a chorus of agony and rage, as the ship's energy bled into the sphere. Voss's body was pushed back against the console as the energy released in a final cataclysmic burst. The entire ship was consumed in the flash of blinding light. Then, silence. The Dyson Sphere, its ancient machinery now destabilized by the overload, began to implode. The once immense, impenetrable structure was being torn apart from within. Its energy, its life, flickered and died, fading into nothingness, and with it the dark tendrils, the ancient entity that had stalked them, and the very shadow of the forgotten legion. All of it was erased. For a brief moment, the darkness of space was still, but Voss's mind was far from still. He knew the cost of victory. He knew that his sacrifice, their sacrifice, had to be absolute. No one would survive this final stand. But in that truth, there was a strange sense of peace. The Kai's whispers were gone. The darkness was gone, and the Legion at long last had fulfilled its duty. Epilogue. A new legenda. Blinding light engulfed the battlecruiser as the reactor went critical. The explosion bloomed across the void, an all-consuming firestorm of pure energy. The flash of light was so intense, it seemed to tear through the very fabric of space itself. The Dyson Sphere, its ancient foundations rattling under the surge of power, shuddered in its final death throes. The overwhelming force of the reactor's meltdown reverberated through the cosmos, and then, for a fleeting moment, everything was still. The once pristine battlecruiser, a vessel that had carried the might of the Phantom Legion through countless battles, was now a scorched shell. The wreckage drifted aimlessly in the cold void, its form barely recognizable, battered, and broken beyond repair. The remnants of the Dyson Sphere, too, were reduced to twisted fragments, floating among the stars like the scattered remains of a forgotten age. But even in the midst of this silence, a lingering sensation lingered in the empty expanse, a strange, unsettling feeling. It was as if, despite everything, something was still there. In the ruins of the battlecruiser, something stirred. The air, though devoid of breath, seemed to carry a faint pulse. Tiny flickers of light sparked from within the wreckage, almost like the dying embers of a long-extinguished fire, slowly reigniting. It was subtle at first, imperceptible, but as the hours passed, the movements became clearer. Something still lived within the husk of the ship. The Phantom Legion was gone, their final stand and their sacrifice a testament to their indomitable will. Or so it seemed. The last of them had perished in the final blast, consumed by their mission, to stop the ancient entity within the Dyson Sphere. Yet as the dark void of space stretched endlessly around the wreckage, the question remained, had they truly died? Perhaps the Legion had not perished at all. Perhaps they had merely transformed, becoming something else, something more. The entity they had fought, the darkness they had faced, had been their trial, and in their triumph they had transcended. The dying light had not only destroyed the sphere, it had changed them. And now, as the wreckage of their battlecruiser floated aimlessly in the vast emptiness, whispers began anew, echoes of soldiers long gone, of warriors who had been reborn. The Phantom Legion, though lost to time, would not be forgotten. Their legend would endure, passed down through the ages as a reminder that no darkness could claim them, not even in death. They were no longer just soldiers. They had become something eternal. The stars above, quiet and watchful, bore witness to their passing. But deep within the silence, beneath the cold gaze of the universe, the Phantom Legion's legacy began to take root. A new legend had begun, and thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Let me know in the comments what ideas you would like the next story to be about. Please leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe, comment.